All right, we're live to tape. Good morning again. This week we're going to look at a very challenging ethicist, not just an ethicist, but some regard Immanuel Kant as the greatest rationalist since Plato. But one component of his philosophy, the one at which we're going to look this week, is probably the easiest of his works to read, although he writes in a way which is not particularly user-friendly, neither in German nor in the English language. Of course, you have his English extract in your textbook. But his theory itself is very important because he's going to attempt to rescue ethics from what Hobbes has shown us. As we saw last week, for Hobbes, ethics are entirely subjective. The idea of good is no different from whatever an individual happens to like. They call good, or the idea of bad, similarly, is attributed to whatever an individual happens not to like. So this is going to differ widely from person to person, and hence Hobbes immediately puts us into conflict with one another on the basis of our tastes alone, our subjective inclinations and our emotions. So what I want to do today is actually to show you briefly how a successor of Hobbes, another very famous British empiricist named David Hume, actually made the problem in some sense worse by introducing a very, again, philosophically famous argument to the effect that we can never derive any moral prescriptions whatsoever from a mere state of affairs. In other words, we can observe factual circumstances, and we may all agree on more or less the facts of the matter. But from there, we're going to be drawing very different kinds of moral prescriptions. So facts and values for Hume are in completely separate domains, and our moral conclusions are not, for Hume, coming from our observations about the world, and nor are they coming from logic. So they must be coming from somewhere else, and again, that is ultimately going to be located somewhere in our emotions. So this opens a specter that is called moral skepticism, and basically it's the notion that we can never use our reason to institute or to derive any kind of morality. And this, of course, flies in the face of Plato and Aristotle. So Hume continues Hobbes's work in a very particular way. He's not referring to Hobbes, but he's doing something, in a sense, even worse. And I'll show you the extract from Hume. So Immanuel Kant in the early 19th century, as we're getting closer now to more modern philosophy, so Kant addresses himself to Hume's problem because he's totally appalled by this idea. As a rationalist, he really wants to restore morality to the province of reason, and that's his main aim. And so in his groundwork to the Metaphysics of Morals, which is a small tract that he wrote in his endeavor to do this, he gives us some really interesting and important notions about morality and about humanity. And we're going to focus on that today and in my breakout group on Thursday. But before we tackle Kant at all, I just want you to see in brief what David Hume has to say, again, following from this idea of Hobbes about the subjectivity of our moral prescriptions. I want you to understand what Hume did to make the problem, if anything, worse, and so that you'll better appreciate how this disturbed Kant and how he then addressed himself to attempting to restore morality, again, to the realm of reason. Okay, so that's our setup for this morning. Is everybody clear about this? That's our roadmap for today's work. And I just want to make sure you have the big picture. Is that all right with you? Yes, no, maybe? Yes, okay, thank you. Just want to make sure that we're still clear. All right, so the first thing I'm going to share then is an extract from David Hume. And this is something you can find. I actually pulled this down from Wikipedia, so it's obviously there. Wikipedia is not necessarily a trustworthy source for scholarly work, nor would I think they're not necessarily trustworthy for a lot of things. But in this case, David Hume's philosophy of morals is certainly a settled matter, and they seem to have gotten this mostly right. So that's why I'm sharing it with you, because I think it's fine as a source. So just bear with me again while I share the screen, and we'll have a look at David Hume and the problem he poses. So again, just bear with me for a second, and I'll pull this up. Okay, are you able to see the is-ought problem, as it's called?
Yes.
This is, yeah, okay, thank you very much. So here's the crux of the matter. David Hume is raising this problem because he's essentially observing that we can never derive what we ought to do, which is a normative kind of prescription, right? What you ought to do the right thing, or you should do the right thing. That sort of is normative prescriptive language in morality, what we ought to do. And Hume's point is that we can never derive what we ought to do from observing, even if we agree on a given is, namely a state of affairs described by the copulative verb, right? The verb to be. So when we say something is the case, or such things are the case, that's what he calls an is statement. And he says and argues very clearly that from a state of affairs described by is or are, we cannot at all derive anything that looks like an ought statement, unless we smuggle an ought statement into the argument, as we'll see in a moment. So there's a significant difference, Hume argues, between descriptive statements about what is and prescriptive or normative statements about what ought to be. Okay, so what is what we could call a statement of fact or of matters of fact, and what ought to be is obviously a statement of prescriptive or normative import. Now look, even worse today, we have deconstruction of facts as well. So I think the situation is even worse than when Hume described it in the 18th century, because at the moment we have a disagreement about basic facts of the matter. Nobody's even agreed about what is the case. And so that does no violence to Hume's argument. It just makes it even more clear, if we don't even agree on what is, then in a certain sense it preempts the problem of trying to derive what ought should be. But anyway, let's look at Hume's argument, assuming we can agree on matters of fact. Let's assume for a moment we can. So he says that in every system of morality that he's met with, he's always remarked, says Hume, these are Hume's words, that the author proceeds for some time in ordinary ways of reasoning and establishes something like the being of a god, or makes observations concerning human affairs. And all of a sudden, says Hume, I'm surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions, is and is not, I meet with no proposition not connected with an ought or ought not. So all of a sudden, we're getting from a state of facts described by is and is not to a state of normatives or prescriptives, which are characterized as what we ought or ought not do about it. And so he says this change is imperceptible, but of the last consequence, meaning it's extremely important. For he rightly, I think, says that this ought, this idea of what we ought to do or ought not to do, expresses some new relation or affirmation. He says it's necessary it should be observed and explained, but authors don't usually do it. And in fact, no one he does it. He's the first to call attention to it. And so he says, I, as authors, do not commonly use this precaution of explaining how they got from is to ought. He says, I shall presume to recommend it to the readers, that's to us. And he is persuaded that this small attention would subvert all the vulgar systems of morality. This is a British understatement. He says this small attention, it's actually enormous, but it's a device of language that the English are fond of using. When they want to underestimate something, they do so in that way, but it's actually extremely momentous, because it says, he goes on, of course, to say that this paying this small attention to the difficulty in deriving ought from is would subvert all the vulgar systems of morality. Well, that's quite true. and in effect that the distinction of vice and virtue, he says, is not founded merely on the relations of objects in the world, such as we perceive them or understand them, nor perceived by reason. So morality is something other than, what happened? It looks like I lost this. It's back again. Can you see it? Is everybody okay? Yeah. So our distinctions of vice and virtue, such as Plato and Aristotle took such pains to make, and as Hobbes, of course, grounds in the emotion, is not founded, says Hume, on the relations of objects. It's not about what's in the world, nor is it perceived by reason. It's all our logical engines, our epistemological engines, are not the things that are deriving moral prescriptions from states of affairs. This is often called Hume's guillotine. All right, Hume's guillotine, a very sharp blade that severs ought from is. So these implications, and you can read this for yourself, are disastrous. They're very profound on prior theories of morality, because what we're left with is a kind of moral skepticism. And this is-ought distinction really threatens the validity of secular ethics. It doesn't threaten the validity of religious ethics, because you can simply declare that God gave us, for example, the commandments of Moses, and so you don't have to worry about how we derive them, because we can say they're God-given. Similarly, any kind of scripture that you may happen to believe in will usually give us what is called, in philosophical terms and even in theological terms, as revealed truth. So truths are not questioned because they're deemed to come from God. However, if we're doing secular ethics, which we are, then this is-ought distinction will obviously be disastrous, because we'll have no sure way of justifying or grounding the normative prescriptions that we would wish to derive or implement. All right? So is that clear, basically? Do you understand the issue at stake, what Hume is doing with his guillotine? Is this much clearer to you? Yes, no, maybe? Just in general, do you understand the principle that's being articulated? Let me give you some examples, and I think this will really make it very clear. Some of you may still be lost. Well, ought, Georgina, is the whole foundation of morality. If somebody says, thou shalt not kill, they're saying to you, you ought not kill. It's a moral injunction, okay? What you ought to do or ought not to do, what any of us ought to do or ought not to do, is generally the way in which we frame moral propositions. So the whole meaning of morality is grounded in what ought or ought not to be done. Is this clear? Is that helpful? And again, because of the relation of ethics and aesthetics, if someone says to you, you ought not to paint your house green or blue or any other color, that's not an ethical kind of an injunction, but it is aesthetic. If you say you ought not to, or you ought not to wear that dress because it clashes with your hairstyle or whatever, people say that's in an aesthetic domain, they're also going to use the word ought. But we're talking now only about the moral component of axiology and the ought statements that apply. All right, so let me give you some examples, and I think this will help to clarify how ought is used in a moral context. And these are some examples I've cooked up deliberately to provoke you, because I want to illustrate Hume's point that we cannot derive ought from is without running the risk of deriving morally contradictory injunctions. This is the whole point that Hume is making. You cannot make a sound derivation as we do in logic. We're all going to agree that 1 + 1 is 2, because that's a logical derivation and we can prove it. We're all going to agree, hopefully, that the earth revolves around the sun, because that's an empirical observation that can be confirmed and demonstrated scientifically. But when we start monkeying with ought, we're going to find it very easy to derive contradictory conclusions from premises that we may all share, from factual circumstances we may all share. And here are some examples, and they're meant to be provocative to make you understand what Hume is talking about. Example 1, we have an is statement. Thousands of children are dying every day from malnutrition. That's unfortunately true. And that's not only in the developing world. We see malnourished children in the USA too these days. So we have this is statement. Thousands of children are dying every day from malnutrition. Well, what should we do about it? What's the moral prescription that you could derive? Well, you could say, therefore, we ought to make greater efforts to feed them. And maybe many of you agree that's what we ought to do. And that's, fine as far as it goes. There's another kind of ought you could derive, though, from the same is. If you assert that thousands of children are dying every day from malnutrition, one could also derive an ought as follows. Therefore, those who cannot feed their families ought not procreate. In other words, a lot of children are brought into the world whose families are not able to feed them. And so one could also derive a different kind of ought, which is to say people who can't feed their families shouldn't procreate children in the first place. Now, those are two very different kinds of ought. So how do we get from an is that unfortunately we can all agree is true to very, very different kinds of oughts? One of them says we have a responsibility, and the other one says basically we have no responsibility. Two different moral conclusions. How do you get that? Well, it's because you can't derive ought straightforwardly from is. If you're puzzled about this, what Hume is really getting at is something very serious. That in order to make either of these arguments valid, you would need to inject another ought statement as a premise. So you could derive ought from ought. So you can derive ought from is and ought, but you can never derive ought from is alone. And perhaps another couple of examples will help to clarify that. Here's another one. Again, it's meant to provoke you into thinking, yeah? We have an is statement that equal opportunity is desirable in a just society, but gives rise to unequal outcomes, all right? That's two is combined, but we can say that this is an is statement. Equal opportunity is desirable and is such that it gives rise to unequal outcomes. This is observable, all right? So one ought you could derive is therefore that unequal outcomes should be socially engineered to make them more equal. That's one possibility if you believe in social engineering. You're going to say that. On the other hand, you could say from the same is statement, you could derive an ought that unequal outcomes should not necessarily be interpreted as evidence of injustice. If we all run a race and we all finish in different positions, it's not necessarily unjust. It's just a matter of actually a fair race. So you could have two different. One ought will justify social engineering. Another ought will disqualify social engineering. But they're both derived, or rather attempted to be derived from the same is statement. Example 3. Here's a different one. Also provocative. It is the case that our planet is undergoing climate change. Well, why? Because the climate has been changing ever since there was a climate. To be pretty blunt about it, the climate change is a fact of life and has been long before there were humans on the earth. However, we can say that our planet is now undergoing climate change. That's a factual statement. So what do you want to derive from that as a moral prescription? Therefore, governments should take drastic legislative action, such as imposing carbon taxes. That's one possible ought, right? Should being synonymous with ought to. You can also derive something very different from it, however. You could say, therefore, government should carefully study all scientific findings to ascertain the precise extent of human impact on climate before making new laws, because it's clear that nature is changing things exclusive of what we do or don't do, and that we're also contributing to change, but we need to understand very, very carefully the human component of that before we make sweeping laws. So anyway, those are two different ought statements coming from the same is. And finally, here's another one. It is evident, example 4, it is evident that some people take offense at other people's jokes. In fact, it's worse than that. Now, it's evident that people can be destroyed because others may take offense at their jokes. But anyway, we'll leave it in its more bland formulation. It's evident that some people take offense at other people's jokes. Stand-up comedians have to be very careful nowadays. All right, and what's the ought? Well, you could say, therefore, any joke that offends anyone ought to be prohibited, and the offender should be punished. And that's pretty much what we do in cancel culture, right? somebody doesn't like something you say, you're pretty much toast. Okay, if the cancel culture gets hold of you, that's one ought. But then again, from the same is, you could also derive a different ought. People ought to realize that they can never be offended against their will, and therefore ought to understand that their feelings are their own responsibility. So if you don't like somebody's joke, that's fine. You're entitled not to like it. But that's you who owns that emotional reaction. It's not the other person who owns your emotions, hopefully. It's you who's responsible. So those are two, and therefore the person should not be punished just because you don't like what they said. So those are two very different oughts, which come once again from the same is. Okay? So, Georgina says, so to be clear, Hume threatens secular ethics. That's because there's no way to justify what is actually correct and what we ought to do. That's exactly right, Georgina. I hope this is, now I see these examples have served, at least with you, their intended purpose, because we can maybe all agree on the is parts of each of these arguments, right? We're not necessarily challenging what is the case in the world. We could agree on some of these ises, as it were, but what we cannot necessarily or at all agree on is what kind of ethics we are deriving, what we should do about it, what we ought to do about it, what we're morally compelled or morally inclined to do about it may be very, very different and in fact drastically opposed one to the other, depending precisely on what we derive from the is. You see? So this is chaos, right? I mean, potentially, it's not only moral skepticism, it's also potentially chaos. So this is the problem Hume poses to us. And yes, ought is not a solution, Ramses, but ought is a moral conclusion, right? What in a moral domain, what kind of ethics are we going to adopt in order to attempt to rectify a state of affairs that we think is in some way wrong, some way morally wrong? But it is the case. So what are we going to do about it is the moral ought that we derive from the is that we observe. Is this clear? So is a reality we see as ought as a possible solution. That's right, Ramses. And because it varies from person to person, again, this is also in line with Hobbes. Everyone is going to do what they feel to be or what they like as the solution. But that brings us into conflict. That's right. We're assuming, Jesse, that is for the when we make the observation about what is, that for the time being it's a state of affairs. It's not changing. I mean, climate change is changing, but the climate's changing. But the state of affairs is that the climate is changing in certain ways that we may feel threatened by. So we think we ought to do something. Yeah. But what ought we to do? I mean, this is the question. All right. So I hope you're all clear. I mean, think about this. This is only a setup to Kant. You need really to appreciate what Kant is trying to do. You will want to understand Hobbes and Hume. And as I'm saying, at the risk of complicating things, yes, it makes a lot of sense. And Hume did not believe in God, and Hume did not drag God into the equation, yes? So if you take existence of God out of the equation and deal strictly with secular ethics, then we're all facing Hume's guillotine. Okay, that's the problem. If you bring God into the equation, you can resolve this problem with religious ethics, but you're still going to get different interpretations. So I will, at least leave it there and show you what Hume is doing. Now, here's the exercise. What I'm saying to you about these examples is really important, and this is what is implicit in Hume's argument. He's not saying it explicitly, but I am, for the sake of being really clear. In each of these examples, two contradictory moral prescriptions have been derived from one and the same fact, right? One and the same state of affairs, on which we can all agree, but we will still end up deriving contradictory moral prescriptions from them. So each argument contains, what I'm telling you that's new, is that each argument contains an implicit ought premise, which it needs to make its derivation work. So in that case, if you add the missing or the implicit premise to each of these is statements, you'll be able consistently to derive your ought from it, but the implicit premise you provide will also be different each one to the next in order to allow you to derive contradictory oughts. So what you're really doing is deriving ought not from is, but from is plus ought. Okay, not from is alone. The exercise you can try at home would be to supply the missing ought statements, the missing ought premises in each of these examples that would allow you to derive the ought that is being derived in all cases. So let's just do one of them together so you can get a handle on this, okay? If we say that thousands of children are dying every day from malnutrition, if we then include an ought statement to the effect that we all have an obligation, we all ought to be able to prevent this from happening, then it would follow that we ought to make a greater effort to feed them. But only if you add that missing ought premise. So you say, okay, it's the case that thousands of children are dying every day from malnutrition. Then you add a premise that kind of that children dying, when we see children dying from malnutrition, it's really a state of affairs that ought to be regarded as intolerable to all of us. And if you make that kind of an ought statement as an implicit premise, now making it explicit, you can therefore derive the conclusion that we ought to make greater efforts to feed those children. Then the argument is valid. But you have to insert another ought in order to derive the ought about feeding them. Similarly, you can insert a different ought premise in the second variation. We can still say thousands of children are dying every day from malnutrition. But if you insert a different ought as an implicit premise, if you say, well, each family ought to be responsible for taking care of their own progeny. If you stick that in as a premise, then you have a very different conclusion. Therefore, those that cannot feed their families ought not procreate. And that argument would also be valid. You see, but in both cases, we made the argument valid by supplying a missing ought. And so what Hume is really saying is that you cannot derive ought from is, but you can derive ought from ought. The problem is, though, this doesn't solve Hume's guillotine. It merely reinforces its cogency, because it's telling us that whatever ought you treat as an implicit premise, whatever ought is so-called primitive or fundamental in your system, is still going to be subjective, because we're all going to disagree on the implicit premises as well. So for an exercise, you could take the other three examples home. This is in your Google Drive folders, this document, and you can supply the implicit premises in each of the other cases that would allow the arguments to become valid, but understand that, as Hume is saying, we're really only deriving ought from is and ought. We need an ought to derive an ought. We can never derive ought from is alone. Okay? So that is, in a nutshell, that is David Hume's guillotine and the immense problem he poses to those of us who want to make moral arguments. All right? So is that all right with you? I've given you this thumbnail sketch of Hume, and again, you can think about the problem. I think most of you are getting this or have already gotten this. But now we're going to look at Kant's really ingenious solution, because Kant is looking for a way to refute this argument. Kant is looking for a way, in effect, to derive ought from is. Kant would like to restore morals and ethical reasoning to the domain of our rationality, as Plato and Aristotle wanted. So he's going to basically try to turn Hobbes and Hume's arguments against themselves and show that there is a way that we can use our reason to be moral beings. Okay, that's going to be Kant's challenge. Well, Susanna, if you understand Hume's problem, there is no solution. Okay, Hume was a very brilliant philosopher. He certainly did bring up the problem. He didn't posit a solution at all because he saw no solution. And in fact, there are still plenty of people in the world who see no solution. Kant tries to posit one, and that's exactly why we're looking at Kant. Is this clear? Is that helpful? Hume posited no solution. Hobbes posited no solution. Hobbes' solution is what? Is to have a power to keep us all in awe. That's Hobbes' solution. Hume's solution is a little bit different. It's not really a solution. He depends on society in a sense to have a kind of, he thinks that we have natural sympathy for each other. He doesn't agree with Hobbes that we're necessarily naturally each other's enemies. He thinks there's a kind of natural sympathy that allows society to find a way forward, but none of it is rational. It's still grounded in the emotions. So basically, we don't have an objective theory of morals, okay? But Kant is going to try and give us one, and that's the immense importance of Kant. So I'm going to stop this share. And now, without further ado, I'm going to present just an overview of Kant with you. Now, Kant is a deontologist. I just want you to remember that deontology is that branch of moral theory. I'm putting it in the chat room. Deontology asserts that the rightness or wrongness of an act is independent of the goodness or badness of its outcome. So deontology is rule-based, and it's telling you what basically are the right or wrong things to do according to the rule book. And there are very famous religious deontologies, such as the Ten Commandments, to which the Abrahamic faiths, for example, subscribe. There are Confucian ethics in Chinese and East Asian societies influenced by Confucius, like Japan and South Korea. And Taiwan, Singapore, they're Confucian societies. They have their ethics also, secular ethics based on Confucian traditions. We have many ethical traditions in the West that are secular. There are these religious traditions also. And they may converge in certain areas. There are also Buddhist ethics. You know, every religion has its ethics, and every secular system has its ethics. But basically, deontology is that branch which is more or less rule-based. So it tells you, basically gives you a rule book. And it tells you what's right or wrong on its face. And if you did the right thing and still got a bad outcome, that's not your fault deontologically. If you follow the rule, generally, you're not going to be blamed if the outcome is less good than you wanted it to be. That's deontology. Next week we'll look at teleology, which tells us that the rightness and wrongness of actions are a function, or entirely a function, of the goodness and badness of the outcomes. So if you got a good result, you did the right thing, according to teleology, not according to deontology. Kant is appalled by that idea. Kant thinks that any consideration of consequences is immoral, actually, that you must do the right thing for its own sake, and not at all because of the consequences. The root word of deontology is deon, the Greek word for duty. So this is duty ethics. In other words, we have a duty to do the right thing and pay no attention to the consequences in the extreme case. All right? As I mentioned to you also, every system of ethics has strengths and weaknesses. Yes? We said this right off the top. And it's important to bear in mind, you may become very fond of or attracted to a particular system of ethics. We're looking at several in this section of the course. But understand that each one that's proposed definitely has some strengths, but also definitely has some weaknesses. Arguably, there's no perfect system of ethics, because if there were, it would probably be the case that most people would adopt it. But since we have moral dilemmas throughout human history, it seems very clear that there's a cause for this, and one of the causes is that there's no perfect system. Deontology has many strengths. And one of its strengths is that it gives people rules, which are usually very clear. The weakness lies basically embedded in the strength that we can agree on rules but not exceptions. Georgina asks, but ought be justified by the consequences? Well, absolutely not, because you're not deriving it from is, you're deriving it from what will be. That's even worse, because we don't know what will be. Right? If you're trying to say, well, we ought to do this because tomorrow it's going to have a good result, nobody can predict the future. We'll look next week, Georgina. I mean, your question is excellent. We're going to look next week at John Stuart Mill, who's one of the great exponents of consequentialist ethics. His system, in fact, of utilitarianism tells you that acts are right in proportion to the amount of happiness they create, and wrong in proportion to the amount of unhappiness they create for all people considered. So that's absolutely, in Mill's system, going to justify doing something according to the consequences. Okay, Georgina? So hang on to that thought until next week when we look at Mill. But for the moment, understand that if you're looking at the Ten Commandments, or you're looking at a secular deontology such as the criminal code, you're taught that you can't go around killing people on a whim. Thou shalt not kill being one of the commandments of Moses, or thou shalt not do murder, depending on how you translate it, right? And we have similarly in the criminal code, and most civilized societies have criminal codes that tell you can't go around killing people just because you don't like their hairstyle or something. So you can't do it. But this has nothing to do with consequences. Please think very carefully that they're condemning the act itself. They're saying there's something in the act itself that's wrong, that's unethical, that's immoral, and therefore the act itself is proscribed. It's not just because of consequences, or not at all because of consequences. It's because the very act of stealing or killing or lying or committing adultery and so forth, this is deemed in many codes of ethics to be wrong in itself. These things are wrong in themselves. Is that clear, Georgina and others? Deontology is coming down on that side. It's saying, well, look, you can't do this because it's a wrong thing. And never mind consequences. It's not going to bring good consequences, but we're only concerned about the act and in qualifying the act in a moral domain. Okay? This is a very interesting problem. So let me say this to you, just to carry on this thought, remind you, Kant is a deontologist and a very strict one. We're going to count. One thing people admire about Kant is also what they tend not to like about Kant. He's very strict. There are going to be no exceptions to some of his moral rules. Whereas our moral rules more generally, whether they come from deontology of a religious kind, like the Ten Commandments, or whether they come from secular deontology, such as the criminal or civil codes, these things, or, professional codes of ethics and so forth, the problem is not the rules. The rules are usually very well thought out. The problem we encounter is that we don't agree on the exceptions to the rules. And I want to give you a very clear example. I'm sure that most of us agree that you shouldn't go around killing people just because you may not like them or they look at you the wrong way. That probably doesn't justify, almost certainly doesn't justify murdering them. All right, that's, I hope, clear. But what are the exceptions? So we have this precept that thou shalt not kill, and we have in our criminal codes all kinds of degrees of crimes involving homicide, whether it's negligent homicide or premeditated murder. There are all kinds of degrees, first degree, second degree, and so forth, and they carry different punishments. But there are rules against doing these things nonetheless. But what about the exceptions? Don't we have exceptions? Yes, indeed. Self-defense, some of you. Yes, of course. Georgina, Jeremy, yeah. Self-defense is one exception. Even that's not clear-cut because it also will vary from state to state, right? Every state has its own legal system as well. Under the Supreme Court is the federal system's top watchdog, but each state has its own justice system. And so abortion, very good example. There's no agreement. Trespassing, again, that's right, there's no agreement. In some states, you could be shot for trespassing. That's right, that would be an exception. So what other exceptions? We have self-defense, abortion, trespassing. What other exceptions do we have to the rule that you can't go around killing people? There are more. War, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. In war, the state will say, well, if that's the enemy, we're going to train you and even pay you to go kill people, right? So that would be an exception. Criminals, that's right. Capital punishment, exactly, Jesse and Georgina, capital punishment. We have more than half the states of this union, I believe, that still have capital punishment. And so the state says, well, you killed somebody, so we're going to kill you. So you're not allowed to kill others, but we're allowed to kill you because you killed others. If that sounds a little bit inconsistent, it certainly is. But we can't resolve the debate. There are always going to be people in favor of capital punishment. And always people opposed to it, precisely because we can't derive aught from is. It may be a fact that so-and-so is a convicted criminal who is guilty of being, let's say, a serial killer. What ought we to do about it is the question. And again, Hume will tell us that we're going to get different moral prescriptions. Different oughts will be derivable from that state of affairs. Euthanasia is another example. So you've come up, all of you, good work. So you've got your thinking caps on, and you've understood, therefore, that we can all agree on the rule you shouldn't go around killing people, but yet look how many exceptions there are, and look at the enormous and intense debates we have in public arenas, in legal arenas, and so forth, over applicable penalties. So you see the problem. Even when you have a clear set of rules, you're not going to get agreement necessarily on the tolerable exceptions. And that's a weakness of deontology. I'm saying it's very strong. People like to have rules, and people generally will try to follow rules if they're reasonable, but the exceptions can't easily be resolved. Okay, you see the problem? We're starting to peel away now some of the philosophical problems that are deeply embedded in any kind of moral theory. So I'm glad that you're seeing this clearly. Okay, so let's go to Kant now and look at his attempt to provide a rebuttal to Hume's guillotine. So Kant is not easy to read. I'm going to share the extract with you that's in your textbook, but you must make an effort, and I will do my best to explicate in very clear terms what Kant would like us to do in order to determine whether an act is indeed to be considered right or wrong, justifiable or unjustifiable in terms of his ethics. He did something very brilliant here, partly because he was provoked by the brilliance of David Hume to answer this. All right, so let me just pull up. I have the table of contents of the text, and I just need to locate Kant in it, so just bear with me for a second while I do this. I know he's in here somewhere, but I'm not at the moment actually finding him. I'm supposed to be here. I know he's here because I've underlined some of what he has to say. Excuse me. So let me just find Kant. Here we are. Ethics in Society. It's in part 5 of your textbook called Ethics in Society, and it's part 5b, Kantian Ethics. So we're going to look at this now, and I'm going to, having located it, I'll share the screen with you. So bear with me once again. And hopefully I can find the textbook. Here it is. Okay, are you able to see, hopefully you're able to see this, Kantian Ethics, groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. Is that right? Are you all seeing this? Okay, thank you very much. So let's carry on then. This is a very brilliant attempt. Whether you agree with Kant or you don't at the end of the day is once again going to be indicative perhaps of Hume's guillotine. But Kant, you will probably acknowledge, whether you agree with him or not at the end of the day, that his attempt to salvage moral theory from moral skepticism and from subjectivity is rather a brilliant attempt. He's considered by many philosophers to be the greatest rationalist since Plato. And hopefully this treatment of his ethics will illustrate why some people believe this. And again, I want to cheer you up. Kant's writing style is not always easy to parse, and nonetheless, we'll make an effort to do so, and I think that your effort will be rewarded once you understand what he's talking about. So the first thing he wants to say is actually about goodness, and this is a refreshingly simple formulation. He says, as far as what good means to him, that it's impossible to conceive anything at all in the world, or even out of it, whatever that means. But in any case, it's impossible to conceive anything at all in the world which can be taken as good without qualification except a good will. Okay? A good will. So this is grounding goodness in your intentions toward others, yes? Toward yourself too, as well as others. So if you have good intentions, it's, I know, what we call an impredicative definition because it's defining a thing in terms of itself. Well, as any philosopher survived Hume's guillotine? Well, it's not philosopher's art, it's moral theory. We're going to look at Kant's attempt, again, to survive it and actually to rectify it. So Kant is saying that it's impossible to conceive of anything except a good will. So goodness is going to be then coextensive with a good will. And he's a little bit reminiscent of Aristotle. Remember Aristotle distinguishing between intellectual and moral virtue? Do you remember that important distinction Aristotle makes? You may be a very brilliant person, in terms of your education, but that doesn't necessarily make you a good person. Do you remember this? Your intellectual capacities may be extremely powerful, but that makes no commentary, says Aristotle, upon your moral character. And this is a bit similar. Not surprisingly, they're both rationalists. So here Kant says intelligence, wit, judgment, and any other talents of mind we may care to name, or indeed the virtues. Here he talks about the virtues, courage, resolution, constancy of purpose, as qualities of temperament, are without doubt good and desirable in many respects, Kant admits, but they can also be extremely bad and hurtful when the will is not good. This is an important point, and please consider it. You may have, once again, great intelligence, great judgment. You may have courage. You may have all kinds of other virtues. But if your will is bad, in the sense that you're willfully setting out to harm people, then Kant says you're not a moral person. You could be doing very bad and hurtful things with a bad will, regardless of your intelligence, wit, judgment, and other virtues of character. Is this clear? So that's partly why Kant wants to identify goodness with a good will. So if you have a good will, then you're good. If you have a bad will, then you're bad. But this is only the prelude to what he has to say. Yes, of course, you would say exactly right. You can pick any sort of monster of history, and you could identify them as being courageous and constant in their purpose and so forth. They're not all brilliant or constant, but yes, you could also say that serial killers have some intelligence in order to be able to gull their victims, right? To lure their victims into their traps. They're very intelligent and appear to be, socially kind of friendly at times, but they're monsters. And so they fool us because of their pretense, their intelligence and their pretended virtue, but they have very bad will. So I think that's clear, and we are probably bound to agree to a certain extent with Kant on that point. Yeah, okay. So let me turn the page. We have to try and get now to his very important moral theory and the work that he's going to do to espouse it. So first of all, here he will be playing the role of strict deontologist by telling us that a good will is not good because of what it effects or accomplishes. So he's divorcing the idea of a good will from outcomes. So that what you accomplish is not what makes you good. It's your good will that makes you good. Yes? It's good because of what it wills in itself and not because of what it attains. So he's already telling us that what you accomplish in life may be fine, but that is not necessarily what justifies morality. What justifies morality for Kant is primarily your goodwill, and he's going to evolve a formula for then deriving what he believes to be deriving ought from is based on a goodwill. Right? So he will take this up in greater detail. But please understand now another really important point that he wants to make. Again, as a deontologist, he's going to tell us that we have to distinguish between judging behaviors. When we judge a certain behavior, we may be totally mistaking the motives that led to that behavior. And he gives the example of a grocer, the corner grocer, okay, who doesn't overcharge his inexperienced customer. It's highlighted here. So you take an example of a grocer and who does not overcharge. So you could send a child to buy a loaf of bread, and the child may not be able to count the change, but the grocer won't cheat the child. The grocer will not overcharge his inexperienced customer, and this, Kant says, would be a sensible thing. Why? Because the shopkeeper knows that by not cheating people, that he will have a good reputation. So he's serving people honestly. But this doesn't mean that he's a moral person, because he could just be doing this in order to make sure he gets a fair share of business. Yeah, the shopkeeper may decide that it's good for business not to cheat customers on change, and so it's not honest, it's prudential. The idea of self-interest, again, back to Hobbes. It's the idea, if you're an honest shopkeeper, it's not necessarily because you're a moral person. It's just because you realize that it's more profitable to be honest. But then you have a profit motive, not a motive of honesty primarily. And that's a motive, therefore, of self-interest, and not at all a motive that Kant would categorize as moral. Do you understand this? Is this clear to you? So what we could interpret as honest behavior might just be self-interest, right? So we would not want to make that mistake, says Kant. Just because a person behaves honestly in society doesn't necessarily mean they're moral either. They could just be self-interested, yeah? He wants to make that distinction. So how do we know? I mean, how can we tell whether someone is really honest or merely prudential? It's an interesting point, an interesting question. All right? So here is what we're going to do now. I'm going to sort of cut to the chase and assume that you're going to do what you need to do in terms of outside reading. And nowhere in this course is it more important that you spend that extra hour out of class for every hour we spend in class together, that you allocate that time to doing the reading of the week and to trying to absorb it. Because Kant is not easy to read, not for philosophers and not for students, but he does have something very important to say. So here is the first point when we start to articulate his moral theory itself. Everything in nature works in accordance with laws. Now, this is something that he's particularly convinced to say because he's already now ensconced in the scientific revolution, that component of the Enlightenment where you have Newton and Newton's laws, Boyle and Charles and the laws of chemistry. So physics, chemistry, he's writing before Darwin, but we have the laws of physics and chemistry being articulated now by the earliest natural philosophers who didn't call themselves scientists because that term was not being used, but they did call themselves natural philosophers and showed us that there are lawful processes in nature and were able to spell them out with some clarity. So this impressed Kant and made him wonder whether, in fact, human moral behavior might also be able to be worked in accordance with laws, and laws derived from reason. So this is the great rationalist attempt to place ethics in concert with some of the other sciences that he saw in his time as being very powerful. So we, of course, are not compelled in the same way as the laws of nature compel us. The problem is that you may disbelieve in the law of gravity, but it's still going to affect you whether you believe it or not. If you jump off the roof, my friends, I'm not suggesting that you do, because you will fall downward, not upward, because the law will compel you regardless of whether you believe it or not. Nonetheless, Kant is kind of drawing a comparison to natural law and saying that we can act in accordance with moral laws if we will to do so. So the will, once again, if you have a good will, you will want to act in accordance with moral laws, says Kant. All right? And we will want to derive actions from laws. And in this sense, reason is that engine that allows us to do it. And the will is therefore, for Kant, a kind of practical reason. What we will to do is going to be a practical application of our reason. So he's already trying to restore moral behavior to that domain. Yes? And then the will is a power, he says, to choose only that which reason independently of inclination recognizes to be practically necessary, and that means to be good. Again, independently of inclination. Inclination here is what Hume says moves us to certain oughts, what Hobbes says moves us to call things we like good, things we dislike bad. That's subjective. Inclination is subjective. So Kant wants us to exercise reason independently of inclination and do what is practically necessary in concert with a good will, and that is going to be a good act. He's going to give us a very, very creative, innovative, and unique test for knowing in advance what it is that we can be assured of as doing the right thing. And that test is called the categorical imperative. This is what he is very famous for among his other accomplishments. A categorical imperative is something that represents an action as objectively necessary in itself. Again, he's emphasizing objective morality as opposed to subjective inclination, and he's emphasizing that it's necessary in itself apart from its relation to a further end. So in other words, consequences are not important. If an act is right in and of itself, we need to perform it independent of the consequences. This is a very strict deontology. It's one of the things that Kant is famous for. Okay? So that there's a discussion here of different imperatives, which you can read on your own and ask me about in class if you have questions. But I want to go to this very specific formulation of the categorical imperative that Kant gives to us in this work. And there's only a single one. And I want you to appreciate this. I'll just read its definition to you, and then we'll look at some examples. It is only one. There's only one, he says, and it is this, quote, act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Now, a maxim is a rule, okay? If you're puzzled about the language, I'll just put that in. A maxim is a synonym for is a rule or a principle. Okay, a maxim is a rule or a principle. You can just think of it as a rule, and that will be fine. A maxim is a rule or a principle. But now I'm not replying to everybody. Or you have this habit of sending me direct messages, and then I get derailed when I try to reply to everyone. I think your contributions are very valuable, and I would appreciate in the future if you say something in class, say it to everybody so we can all benefit from your thinking and your questioning. So I'm replying to all now that a maxim is a rule or a principle. So back to Kant. Acts only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Now, this is called the categorical imperative. This is what Kant identifies as one single moral rule that will cover all circumstances or most circumstances. When you want to know if what you're about to do is the right thing or the wrong thing, you can put it to the test. So what Kant is really giving us here is something very innovative. It's a meta-rule. The categorical imperative, if you like, is a meta-rule according to which you can test any moral rule that you're about to implement or disregard. And a rule that passes, or an action motivated by a rule that passes the categorical imperative test, is something then that is not only morally permissible, but morally obligatory. If it passes the categorical imperative test, you have to do it, or refrain from doing it, as the case may be. But it becomes a moral necessity based on reason. And I'm going to show you in a moment how it works. It's very clever, because it takes this process of moral reasoning that we go through at times out of the domain of subjectivity, out of the domain of subjective inclination and personal likes and dislikes, and relocates it squarely into the realm of reason, to the realm of rational thought. This is Kant's answer to Hume and to Hobbes both. So again, he repeats it. Act as if the maxim of your action were to become through your will a universal law of nature. He repeats this in a couple of dozen different ways during his unfolding in the text, but understand that each of these formulations is deemed to be synonymous. The most common one is act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. And so, here is the thing. He gives examples I'll discuss next day in our breakout group, but I want to look at some generic examples first to show you how this law actually applies if you wanted to do it in the next 10 minutes. I want to illustrate how you would go about doing this. Let's say, for example, that you are contemplating telling a lie. All right? Now let me ask you this question. Have any of you been tempted? At times, you don't have to confess, I'm not recording this, I'm not reporting this. I'm just asking, have any of you at times been tempted to tell a lie in order to extricate yourself from a difficult situation? Yes? Okay, that's very quick. Of course, you say, like it's normal, absolutely. Yeah, all right. So there's no problem extracting from you this notion that at times we are tempted to lie because it would appear that we can save ourselves from some difficult situation. So Kant would say that, remember, if you're going to tell a lie, then it's not about saving yourself. It's not the consequences that should matter at all. It's whether your will can actually allow it to be a universal law. And here's how it works. The maxim that you formulate, in other words, should I be morally permitted to tell a lie in this situation? The categorical imperative transmutes that maxim to the following: can I will it to be a universal law that people lie? And if the maxim does not self-destruct in the process of being converted to a universal law, then the maxim will allow you to do whatever it is in that particular situation. So the categorical imperative is a test that elevates or expands your individual intention to do something to a universal law and asks you a hypothetical question. If this thing were to be a universal law, would it actually work in a universe where everybody had to behave this way all the time? Or would it logically self-destruct? And if it would logically self-destruct, then it fails the test. And that means if it fails the test, you yourself may not do it. Okay, yes, well, I'm glad. It is a moral compass, Ramsey. Ramsey's excellent, excellent. It is an unfailing moral compass for those who choose to adopt it. And Jesse, if it's making you rethink your actions, then it may save you from being a Hobbesist or a Humean. But let's have a look at a quick example of what it means. This is really key. I need you guys all to understand what it means for something in Kant's terms to self-destruct in a hypothetical universe in which it's universal law. So we'll go back to the situation where one of you or more of you may be tempted, or I myself may be tempted to lie to save myself from an uncomfortable or an embarrassing situation. I'm tempted to tell a lie. Okay, so Kant says, imagine a world in which everybody is lying all the time. That's what the categorical imperative compels us to do. Imagine a hypothetical universe in which it's a universal law that everybody has to lie. Now, is that going to work or is that not going to work? Imagine a universe where everybody's lying all the time. So are you going to be able to successfully lie in such a universe? Yes or no? No, that's right, Jesse, but why not? Why would it not work? In a universe where everybody is lying all the time, which is what the categorical imperative demands we imagine, of course a lie is not going to work. And why will a lie not work? Because no one will be trusted. That's exactly right. Because you know in advance, you already know in advance that in a universe where everyone is compelled to lie all the time, that whatever anybody says is a lie, and therefore your lie is not going to be believed. Because we all know that everyone's lying all the time, correct? And so in that case, Kant claims that on logical grounds, the maxim self-destructs. It becomes impossible to lie successfully in a universe in which lying is a universal law. And therefore it fails the test of the categorical imperative. And therefore, the conclusion is you may not tell a lie because it fails the test of the categorical imperative. Now imagine the inverse situation. Imagine a universe in which everyone is always telling the truth. Imagine that. And we ask the same question. Will this maxim self-destruct? In a universe where everybody's telling the truth, would you have a problem telling the truth? And the answer is no, you wouldn't. Because if it's a universal law to tell the truth, then everyone is telling the truth. And what you say is also the truth, and everybody believes it because they know it to be true. And so, therefore, the maxim does not self-destruct in such a universe. So this is how, by purely rational means, through the categorical imperative, Kant is actually creating a deontology in which we have a very clear guideline. And that is by acting only on the maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Immediately from this example, we realize that we're all supposed to be telling the truth all the time and never lying. And that such a universe, in fact, would be a very good one to inhabit. It would be both logically and morally consistent. So that is how he finesses this problem. and how he restores moral reasoning to the domain of rationality. Let's take another example, a very different kind of example. Would it be okay, let's say, you're tempted to take something that doesn't belong to you, right? Maybe to shoplift, or I'm not saying you are, I'm just saying hypothetically, you might imagine, or you find money in the street and you're tempted to just put it in your pocket because it doesn't seem to belong to anybody, and, finders keepers, right? So should you take something that doesn't belong to you, right? So we're asking really, in a certain sense, about theft, and is that justified? Should we take something that doesn't belong to us? So once again, let's apply the categorical imperative. Kant would say, act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will it should become a universal law. Okay, so if I'm going to take something that doesn't belong to me, and I know it doesn't, but I'm going to be tempted to take it anyway, what would it do if I made that a universal law? Suppose now that we inhabit a universe in which, in fact, everybody is constantly taking things that don't belong to them. Would that work? Would that maxim go through without logically self-destructing? Well, you're giving the right answer, Georgina and Ramsey, because you know in advance probably that Kant thinks stealing is wrong, and he does. But the trick here is explaining why it collapses. Why does the categorical imperative, if we make stealing into such a rule, why would it self-destruct? Taking things that don't belong to us would self-destruct as a universal law. Why would it logically? Yes, because nobody would have any. You guys are on the ball. Well, that's good. Kant is not easy, but you seem to have got a handle on this. Both of you, Georgina and Jesse, are giving a good answer because basically nobody could own anything. That's the crux of the matter, Jesse, that if we imagine a universe in which taking property that doesn't belong to us is a universal law, then in fact there would be no property. You see, taking somebody else's stuff, if we all did that all the time, then there wouldn't be any property, and therefore there wouldn't be any theft. That's right, Susanna, you're brilliant. So it would no longer be stealing. So in a universe in which everybody is stealing, in fact, we deconstruct the meaning of theft. Because if nobody owns anything, then it's impossible to steal. You get it? If nobody owns any property, then theft has no meaning. It's like a Hobbesian state of nature. Theft has no meaning. And so if theft has no meaning, then in fact you can't will it to be a universal law that everybody should take everybody else's property, because the law would self-destruct in practice. There would be no property at all. It's not because everyone's doing it, Susanna. You have to think more deeply than that. It's no longer stealing, since if stealing is a universal law, then there is no property anymore, because everything that everybody owns is stolen. If everything that everybody owns is stolen, then it never belonged to anybody, because whoever owned it in the first place stole it too. So there's no property whatsoever. Okay, you get it? That's right. The same with the universal. You're seeing, Jesse, good. You're seeing the commonality here. Okay? So it's a little bit subtle, but remember that we're acting in such a way so that the maxim would be a universal law if and only if it does not self-destruct in such a hypothetical universe. So this is the test. It's a very convenient test. You could try this at home before you're tempted to do anything with moral, with any kind of moral content. You can ask yourself, what I'm about to do, if it were a universal law, would the maxim that makes it a universal law logically contradict itself in a hypothetical universe in which it were a universal law? If it will not contradict itself, then it's fine. Right? Then in fact, I'll have a duty to do it because I have a good will. That's Kantian ethics. In a nutshell, all right, we've accomplished a lot this morning in a very short time. And you see how it answers Hume, because it restores moral reasoning to this hypothetical world of is. This is a hypothetical universe in which such a behavior is a moral law, is a universal law, and then we ask ourselves whether it is the case that it logically contradicts itself. And if it does not logically contradict itself, then not only ought we to be able to do it, but we have an obligation to do it. If it contradicts itself, then it's going to be a thing that is wrong, because it contradicts the categorical imperative, the maxim self-destructs, and therefore we know that we're not permitted morally to do the given thing. And this works in all cases, although with some difficulty. So let me just summarize this for you. It's a test, as you've understood, not of a particular action, but actually of what would happen if that action were universal law. You see that it's very innovative, it's very clever. Kant has come up with this in order to give us a way of testing our moral rules in advance. And again, it has nothing to do with consequences. It has to do with the logical integrity of a precept, just in case that precept were to be a universal law. In my opinion, and it's only an opinion and you don't have to share it, I think that most people in the world are not Kantians. Kant lived the way he walked the walk. He didn't just talk the talk. He was regarded as being a very upright, morally upright teacher of philosophy. He had led a quiet life. He never left his village of Königsberg. Maybe that's why it was easier for him to hypothesize universal maxims and act on them, because he didn't get embroiled too much in politics and in society. But he was a very morally upright person, according to his students, who loved him very much, who respected him very much, and we still do to this day respect him as an upright philosopher. But what he's trying to do is, again, to answer Hume and to answer Hobbes on this question. I believe, my opinion is that the world would be a better place if more people were Kantian. It's another paradox, because you can't coerce people. You can put that to the categorical imperative too, and say, well, could we force people to be Kantians by legislating or by coercion? And the answer turns out to be no. If we made it a maxim, that people could be coerced into obeying the categorical imperative, it would also defeat the categorical imperative. So you can't put a gun to someone's head and say, act like a Kantian, because then they wouldn't be acting out of a good will. They'd be acting out of coercion. So interestingly enough, we can't compel this. We can only suggest it. It's more expanded think before you act. Well, Jesse, it's a very specifically expanded think before you act. It's very specifically expanded into the dimension of, if your action were to become a universal law, would it remain consistent in such a hypothetical world? And if so, then indeed you may and must act on that maxim. If not, then you mayn't and must not act on that maxim. Okay? So it's a meta rule. It's a way of testing all other moral rules, but prior to enacting their prescriptions. Okay? So please do read Kant for yourselves, and read Hume first to make sure you understand what he's saying, and then read Kant as an answer to Hume, and make sure you understand as much as you can not only what Kant is telling us, but why he's telling us this. And on Thursday, in our breakout group, I will go over Kant's examples. He gives 4. And we'll also look at something extremely important. This is only really part 1. There's a second formulation that he gives in this book. And the second formulation is a very early, relatively speaking, and very humanitarian argument for dignity. Kant was one of the first philosophers to argue in a very clear and emphatic way for autonomy and dignity of the person, things which in contemporary society we deem to be extremely important. As much as you can't, Ramses could be a pun. Yes, what you can and can't do. This lends itself to endless puns, thanks to Kant's name. But to return to Thursday's challenge, and I hope in your other breakout groups, you'll look at Kant's examples and understand them, in his terms, and also the second formulation of the categorical imperative, which is to treat other persons as ends in themselves, not just as means to your ends. In other words, to treat people with dignity and autonomy. And we place a great premium on that in contemporary society. I think even the United Nations and the Millennium Development Goals and other kinds of things of that sort are dedicating themselves now to espousing dignity as a human right. Is it not the case that there's now a lot of talk about dignity as a human right? Fundamentally, we have a right to be treated with dignity. Have any of you heard talk about that social justice context and so forth. Yes, and people, I think, rightfully deserve to be treated with dignity. This is a common denominator of all humanity. Just by virtue of being human, we are entitled to a certain dignified treatment. And so dignity becomes a foundational thing in contemporary moral theory, but it's also something that Kant is one of the first to raise. You won't find dignity very much in the ancient world, but you will find this notion of dignity in Kant, and we'll look at that on Thursday as well. Okay, are there any quick questions? I've given you a lot to think about this morning, but of course that's what we're supposed to do in a philosophy class, so I hope it gives you food for thought, and it's safe to try this at home. See what you think about it. Any quick questions before we wrap this up today? Everybody's speechless. That's okay too. I see you have you're very welcome. I see you're developing a chat, and that's a good thing. That you discuss these things in groups, as long as you don't take each other off in some crazy tangent on the in the wrong direction. If the group helps to make things clear to you, then I certainly think it's a good idea. As long as the group stays on track, it's a very good thing. Okay, you're more than welcome. Have a wonderful day, wonderful week. Stay safe. I'll see some of you on Thursday. And the rest of you, I will see you on Monday next week. We'll look at John Stuart Mill, who's the complete opposite of Kant. By now, you're not surprised. When we encounter moral theories in successive weeks that contradict each other, we're going to look next week at John Stuart Mill, who believes that actions are right and wrong strictly based on the consequences that they bring. So I'm glad, Georgina, that you enjoyed it. Thank you again, all of you, and have a great day. See you soon. Bye-bye for now. I'll stop the share. And I'll stop the recording. Take care, everybody. Look forward to seeing you soon. Be well.
Thank you, Professor.
You're more than welcome.